Welcome to Clinical Data Talks, a podcast brought to you by CRS Cube. I'm your host, Sylvain Berthelot. Join me and industry experts as we discuss the latest trends impacting the world of clinical data. Today we're going to focus on clinical data from the patient's point of view, and I couldn't think of a better guest for this than Ella Balasa. A passionate advocate for patient-centric innovation, Ella has become a leading voice in shaping more inclusive and collaborative approaches to clinical trials. With deep personal experience navigating the healthcare system, she works closely with industry stakeholders to ensure the patient voice is truly embedded in clinical research. Hi Ella, thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
Wonderful, Sylvain. Thank you for having me.
Well, we've already recorded a podcast together in the past, so I know we're in for a treat, and I'm very passionate as well about today's topic, so I'm sure it's going to be amazing. And I'm going to start with maybe a tough question. You tell me if it is.
Okay.
But from your experience, what you see in the clinical trial industry, what do you think are the biggest challenges patients face when enrolling in clinical trials?
I think first and foremost, the greatest challenge and barrier is really awareness and knowing about trial opportunities that might exist for a particular patient for their disease area. I think that, it's widely known that a lot of clinical trial enrollment happens through the provider or through the physician at their particular care centers. But, with, first of all, heavy patient load, doctors are not necessarily aware of a lot of trials that exist around the country. There is, if the patient is not seen at a medical institution that conducts a lot of their own clinical trials or is a hub of research, then a lot of patients, outside of that don't have opportunities to learn about or to participate in trials. So I know there are increasingly platforms and technologies that are trying to bridge these gaps and bring about, through digital means and other ways by which to reach patient populations about clinical trial opportunities. But I think it still is a very big gap that exists. And unfortunately, those in more rural community hospitals or those that, as I said, are not seen at these large academic institutions are not getting the same opportunities to participate and learn about clinical trials and clinical research opportunities. I think secondly, more so when it comes to the actual trial itself, the burdens that the burdens from having to travel to the sites or the complexities of the procedures and tests that are required and the involvement for or the burden on the patient to be a trial participant, it can be overwhelming, I think, especially for populations whom may not be used to a lot of medical involvement or intervening, right? If they are new to healthcare systems and relationships or connections with physicians and other hospital staff, there may be a lot that is required of these patients, and there are gaps in the ease of how this patient is being walked through or supported throughout the trials. So I think there can be just broadly speaking, improvements in how that's managed and how the patient is being, facilitated through the trial experience.
Yeah, both very good points. A very short anecdote about knowing about trials that are available. So I've got my patient advocacy podcast and I talk to patients regularly. And someone in one of the episodes shared that they go on ct.gov, clinicaltrials.gov for those who don't know it, to look for trials that are upcoming or enrolling. But as they were explaining that, I was thinking, but how do they navigate it? Because it's not user-friendly, not even patient-friendly. It's just not user-friendly at all. So yeah, glad to hear that there are tools that hopefully will help with that in the future.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, there is a number of companies that are trying to solve this, but obviously, it's fragmented, and I think some approaches that are bringing in the advocacy organizations to support this in their respective disease areas potentially could have the most traction or benefit, whereby which there is sort of a vetting process or just sort of this trust kind of building layer where the patient can be aware of these trials through these organizations that are supporting the well-being of the patients and supporting holistically the lives of the patient, not just not just the clinical trial kind of or physician perspective or experience. So I think that's a great way too.
Yeah. I was half expecting you to also mention exclusion-inclusion criteria that could be a barrier to patients' participation because they can be restrictive, essentially.
Yes.
What's your experience with that? And do you think it can restrict access for patients?
Well, I'd love to sort of bring in my own personal experience into this topic because, yes, absolutely. Exclusion criteria is a very significant barrier to participation. And I personally have experienced this myself. Having cystic fibrosis, I have reduced lung function. So my lung function is less than 40% FEV1, which is FEV1 is the measure of lung function. And in all new investigational drug trials for cystic fibrosis, it's only patients with above 40% have been included into trials, and that's for a variety of reasons. But I've been very strongly advocating for the broader inclusion of patients in trials because there is a whole subset of the population, such as myself, who could readily and meaningfully contribute to clinical trial data and the understanding of how there's a whole population of patients that a lot of these trials are not capturing data from. And so if we can really be innovative in the way that we're designing trials and making sure that in some part they're either maybe it's not data that's collected for the main arm of the study, but maybe as data is collected, we can, there can be ways by which to incorporate data from a broader swath, from a broader population of patients, and then, provide that potential benefit where, especially in, rare diseases, pediatric diseases, where there is a significant, these are life-limiting conditions where there is not a lot of research and treatments that exist. And so there's a very, very high need. And it not only is potentially, could improve quality of life, of course, if the patient, is able to be on drug in the trial, but it just really expands that knowledge base for when the treatment does come to market and there is already that data that's collected from really a broad population with any disease area. And then, of course, that supports with reimbursement and in the post-marketing, phase of the drug itself too. I think we have the ability to, bring about these innovations and changes in the design of trials between collaborating closely between FDA, between sponsors, and bringing in the patient perspective into these early conversations to really help to facilitate this awareness from even the regulatory side of how more inclusive data could really benefit, obviously the population, but then also the understanding of how the effect of this treatment, any given treatment as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's interesting because there's obviously there's a benefit for the patient. So from your point of view, not being able to enroll in a trial means that you don't benefit from the treatment early. But I want to go back to something you said earlier on, which is that essentially there's a benefit for the sponsor as well, because they gather more data, which with an open mind may show something that they were not expecting. But I feel like we're in a situation where and I think that's true, that we know exactly what we want to demonstrate when we start a trial. But going back to a point that you raised earlier as well, there's so much that patients may not be able to accommodate, that it feels like we've written something and we're trying to make it fit the patient population rather than working with the patient population to know what could work and what they would benefit from. So from your point of view, what do you have an appreciation for what patients are able to accommodate? What will a patient do to take part in a trial, and where will it be too much for them?
It's hard to answer that from just one patient perspective myself, and of course it varies very widely based on the community and the burden of the condition itself, and how much it would take for a patient to be a participant in the trial on top of the management of their care on a day-to-day basis. But I would say that when it comes to for example, with patients that have mobility problems, or pediatric populations where that person needs a caregiver to assist them in getting dressed, getting into a wheelchair, getting out of the home, getting to a clinical site, basically every step of the way, there needs to be somebody present and supporting that participant and that patient. These can be, these are very high burdens to, accommodate or to participate in a trial that's going to require, in-person visits, multiple, once or twice a week, even for any given length of time. And so I really, strongly advocate for how to make trials provide the optionality for each participant, and even within the same disease area, and within the same trial, there can be a wide range of a patient's ability to either travel to a site or to perform any given procedures or tests, and there can be some patients that prefer to go into a site, or versus have at-home care where there can be monitored and get data that's collected seamlessly, and that can also be more of a socio kind of like a personal preference as well. Do they want people in their homes or not, who are strangers, or providers or nurses, and how that might affect or disrupt, how it could either provide seamless care or disrupt maybe their day-to-day lives if they're working in person, and they may have to then go home to receive from a home health care provider and get blood tests done. So then that may actually be an extra burden or an extra step. Maybe then at-home care wouldn't necessarily be feasible or make the most sense if the person is already out of the home and on their lunch break or something can go to a site. So to say is that dependent on the disease population, and just even within the same clinical trial, building into the trial design the option for patient, for the flexibility for any given participant to have the trial seamlessly integrate into their day-to-day lives in the easiest way possible, so that participation supports this, instead of becoming an increasing burden or hindrance.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's a lot more talk, I believe, about including the patient's perspective in trial design. I don't know if it's just talk or if it's action as well. But from your point of view and your experience working with the industry, how would you qualify meaningful patient involvement in trial design?
I agree that, there currently, I would say there is fairly limited integrated involvement of patients into the early design of trials. And even before the design process begins, and really understanding that patient population from what are their needs, their burdens, what does the disease landscape look like, what are the patient preferences, and really understanding that from not just broadly the disease area, but actually connecting directly with specific patient, certain patients, disease advocacy organizations as well, and then bringing those and that involvement throughout the design, with the conversations in the design of determining primary endpoints and what is data that's going to meaningfully represent or capturing what is meaningful to that community. So, taking the example of cystic fibrosis again, the FEV1, which is the measure of lung function, is always considered the primary endpoint in cystic fibrosis trials, which, from a high level makes sense. I mean, you're measuring how much lung function improves. Therefore, you assume, okay, they're having, person would have better quality of life, more ability to exercise, less tired, being less tired, et cetera, et cetera. But in, populations where there's a lot of lung damage that already exists, like in the CF, for my own health, for example, even any treatment really doesn't improve that lung function value, that number, because of the structural existing damage that the lungs have. And so, with any given treatment, there may not be this significant improvement in the lung function itself, but that, there can be significant changes in, day-to-day levels of coughing, tiredness, the clearance of the airways, and reduced need for antibiotic use to treat lung infections and so forth. And so, but all of this, it's if we have the primary endpoint of lung function, well, then this isn't really being captured. And so that's also why, to go back to the point of inclusion and exclusion criteria, this population of patients isn't included into the trials because they may not see that benefit in the lung function improvement. So just coming full circle there. But all that to say is, this needs to be closely understood by sponsors, and bring in these patient voices directly early on, before the design, before you have to go through and make amendments and such, so that we're designing trials together with patients that we're going to be inclusive of a broader population, and we're going to be measuring what is most meaningful for their improvement in their day-to-day lives. And this includes also in those early conversations with the FDA, because of course regulators are, in any given disease area, they're used to getting data from, a certain indication where, as far as, if there's been trials that exist in the past in that indication, then that's the way that they're used to seeing, or like, well, why is, if we're going to be changing up endpoints, or if we're going to be being more inclusive in these designs, there needs to be some of that community backing. And so this is a way by which sponsors can collaboratively, it's holding hands with patients, with the patient community together, and bringing this forth, through the regulatory process as well. And it helps to, get more, I would think, support for this kind of like innovative designs and such. So I think this kind of true partnership is still quite rare. I do see it increasingly more so, and hopeful for the future, in that with the use of these types of even technologies, like creating digital endpoints, and for example, there's in cystic fibrosis a device that's pretty accurately measuring cough levels, and that's potentially, these types of wearables and technologies can really complement and integrate into, and already are, into these designs, and making sure that we're capturing what is most impactful for patients.
I love what you're saying. I love it. It's interesting because essentially what you're saying is everyone should work together, so that we understand patients and their day-to-day life better, so that then we understand what is more meaningful to them. But I really like that you also mention talking to regulatory agencies about it, because obviously if they're not used to seeing other endpoints than FEV1, then they're not necessarily going to understand, and that can delay trials. So it makes sense. But you also talked about the link with technology then, which needs to be taken into account, because if you can measure things differently, especially at home, then that can even that can help even further with understanding the results that you're getting and the improvements.
Well, and yeah, and to add to that, exactly, it's, often some of these measures, or patient-reported outcomes, are just that. They're reported from the patient, so they're often not, used as primary or secondary endpoints, right? Sometimes, or maybe sometimes secondary endpoints, but it's really, the data is maybe not as quantitative. And so for the example of, using a device that accurately measures rates of coughing for, any given day for a patient, and, pulmonary type of condition, this is really, much stronger data than, a patient-reported outcome measure. And that can also better support, the use of this kind of data, in as a primary endpoint. So this is a value in the way by which technology can be really interwoven here.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have experience with that yet, because clinical trials are very long, but what do you think a sponsor can achieve in terms of clinical trial results or clinical trial execution by following your advice of working with patients even before trial design?
Well, I think it's multifold. I think first, you are establishing that early relationship with the patient communities. So you already have, coming in with a strong relationship being built, that trust factor, patients, the broader population, having probably learned about this type of collaborative effort and work, in the design, and in creating this type of, novel way by which this treatment can be capturing, data from patients. So you're really collaborating, you're building that relationship early on. That then in turn provides more, as we said at the beginning, the problem of awareness of the trials itself, of patients being more eager potentially to participate, as it is more meaningfully capturing or integrating into their lives, maybe reducing those excessive burdens of participation. So then they're more likely to want to participate, and then also less likely to fall off the trial and terminate early. And then when it comes, so then this can then shorten timelines potentially for the trial getting to the market and actually helping the entire population that it's intended for. So, and then of course, just from the sponsor side too, shorter timelines, less, cost later on down the line in recruitment and I don't know the numbers here, but obviously I know like each month that a trial is delayed adds like X amount of dollars to the budget. So sure, it requires, I think, a bit more upfront planning, collaboration, even monetary commitment. But I think, down the line, it's a strong benefit for all parties, for patients, for sponsors. And really in just, improving, hopefully, patients' quality of life for any disease area.
Yes, yeah. So there's no reason not to do it, essentially. So hopefully, I'm really hopeful. Every time I talk to you, actually, I'm very hopeful and positive for the future because I feel like it's progressing and going in the right direction. So hopefully, we see change, even more change, coming up in the coming years. I have one last question for you. What's the best piece of advice you've received that you apply at work?
I think my passion drives my work. Obviously, given the health experiences and just navigating my own care and wanting to see improvement for not only my own health in my life, but on behalf of my community, the cystic fibrosis community, and more largely too, just patients who struggle day to day and in navigating their care and in clinical trials. And so I would say the advice that I received fairly early on from other advocates and other patients who I saw were getting involved in these capacities and in raising their voices is exactly that, is to be a voice for your mission and your community and your passion, and to not be deterred or not be afraid. There's not saying like doors open all the time and opportunities to, for example, early on I was asking to be a patient involved in the review of clinical trial protocols, and I published articles on the problem of minimal inclusion into trials and the design of novel endpoints and the problem that is for patients. And I wasn't deterred by maybe not being able to publish this work or what the backlash or what people might think about my perspective, based on at the time somewhat limited experience. I've learned a lot the more years that I've been involved in this space, and as I've learned generally the healthcare ecosystem. And I think it's to summarize, kind of going back, is just to say that I want to encourage others to be voices for their passions, for their communities, and for what they want to see in changing the future of healthcare and clinical research for patients.
Amazing. I love it. And you can feel the passion. So that I don't doubt at all that that's something you apply day in, day out. Oh, thank you so much, Ella, for joining me on this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always. And as I said earlier, it really makes me happy to hear you and makes me positive for the future of clinical trials and how inclusive they're going to be.
Thank you, Sylvain. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening to us today. You can find more episodes of the podcast on the CRS Cube website.